On a range outside Norfolk, late in 1987, a Navy SEAL lined up for a routine qualification, the kind he had done 100 times. He was not under fire. He was not in danger anyone there could have predicted. Then the pistol in his hands came apart in his face. The slide had split in two, and the rear half struck him, drawing blood. This was not the M1911, the .45 that had ridden in American holsters through 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam, without anyone needing to ask what was hiding inside the steel. This was its replacement, the pistol that had won in committee rooms, against numbers nobody in the field had ever seen. It had won on paper. Paper had never been the problem. What broke that day was something paper could not measure, and the American men closest to it would never trust it again. For most of a century, nobody in the American military had to think about which pistol to trust. John Browning built the M1911 in 1911, and it simply outlasted every argument anyone tried to have about it. It rode through the trenches of the First World War, across the Pacific and through Europe in the Second, into Korea, into the jungles of Vietnam. Soldiers learned its weight without being taught it. A young private was handed a worn .45 by a non-commissioned officer who did not bother explaining how it worked, because the gun had already explained itself to 3 generations before him. It was not a choice. It was inheritance. Nobody asked what was inside the steel, because nobody had ever needed to. Then, in the late 1970s, the argument started somewhere far from any battlefield, in a congressional hearing room, over a ledger. Investigators discovered the United States military was carrying more than 25 different handgun types and over 100 kinds of ammunition, a quartermaster nightmare nobody had built on purpose. Every branch had picked its own sidearm over the decades. Congress wanted 1 gun, 1 round, 1 line on a supply sheet instead of 100. A program was stood up to make that happen, the kind of fix that gets ordered by men with clipboards, not men who had ever had to bet their life on a sidearm. And that was the quiet fracture line running underneath everything that followed, a decision made on paper, headed toward a test only the hand could give. What followed was nearly a decade of testing, protest, and second-guessing. The first trials, run by the Air Force at Eglin, starting in 1979, favored a sleek Italian entry from Beretta, but the Army disputed the rigor of the testing, and the results were thrown out without much explanation to the men waiting on an answer. The Army ran its own program next, then quietly canceled it in 1982, releasing almost nothing about why. By 1983, a new round began, the XM9 trials, and this time 8 pistols entered, from Colt to Smith & Wesson to Heckler & Koch to Sig Sauer to Beretta. One by one, they fell away under stopwatches and clipboards, engineers watching rivals outperform their own designs and saying nothing, until only 2 were left standing, the Sig Sauer P226 and Beretta 92F. On paper, the 2 pistols were nearly identical in performance. Beretta won not by outshooting its rival, but by underbidding it a few $1,000,000 cheaper across the full package of spare parts and magazines. The man who made it official was General John A. Wickham, Army Chief of Staff, who signed the adoption order on February 14, 1985. Wickham had never carried a sidearm in combat. His career had been built through command staff postings and policy roles, the kind of officer the Army produces specifically to manage programs like this one, men who understood budget lines and supply logistics better than the feel of a grip after 6 hours on patrol. He was not the villain of the story. He was the right man for the job the Army had decided needed doing, and he did it. He signed the document. The pistol that had outlived the Kaiser and the Korean War and the jungles of Vietnam was retired by a pen stroke on a procurement form. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of 74 years of service. A line item closed, a new contract opened, and the men who would carry the result had no vote in any of it. The losers did not go quietly. Smith and Wesson filed a legal challenge, arguing the testing had unfairly counted it out. So did Sig Sauer's American representative, alleging the pricing had been rigged against them. Most of the protests were dismissed outright, but the Government Accountability Office found enough in Smith and Wesson's complaint to order a partial retest. And the larger investigation dragged on for years at Congress's own insistence because somebody in Washington needed to be certain this decision could survive scrutiny. Colt filed its own protest, arguing the American manufacturer had been systematically disadvantaged against a foreign competitor, and the argument found sympathetic ears in a Congress that had not anticipated explaining to constituents why America's military pistol was now made in Italy. On paper, the argument was already settled. The contract was signed, the production lines were running, and the first M9s were already moving through the supply chain toward men who had not been consulted about any of it. In practice, the argument had not even started. On September 23, 1987, a member of Naval Special Warfare was running a routine range qualification when the slide of his Beretta 92 fractured at the point where it locked into the frame. The rear half came back and struck him in the face, hard enough to need stitches. He was not the last. In January of 1988, two more operators from the same community were injured the same way, one losing a tooth, another left with a bruised chest where the broken steel caught him. A man trained to trust his weapon without thinking suddenly had every reason to question it. In a unit built entirely on the certainty that your equipment will not fail you at the moment that matters, that kind of doubt does not stay quiet, and it does not leave easily. Government investigators later counted 14 slide failures in total, most of them surfacing in laboratory testing rather than the field, with 4 causing real injury to real men. The official record lived in a Government Accountability Office report numbered NSI AD 88-213, far from any press conference, and the explanation it contained split the room along the same lines the contract had. Beretta pointed to the ammunition, arguing the rounds supplied by the United States military exceeded NATO pressure specifications and were punishing steel never designed to absorb that kind of force, while the Army's own metallurgists pointed the other way, toward the toughness of the Italian-made slides themselves. Neither side ever fully backed down. Beretta eventually sued the United States government for defamation over how publicly the Army had blamed its manufacturing, and won, which meant the government that had accused them of building a defective weapon then paid to redesign it, funding a new slide engineered to hold together even if it cracked, so a fractured half could never again travel back toward a shooter's face. The company was vindicated in court. The government wrote the check. Neither fact ever made a press release. Around the same time, inspectors found cracks forming in the frames of newly produced pistols. The Army called them cosmetic, a word that let the contract keep moving, even though those same cracks technically violated its terms. Somewhere, a contract officer signed off on that word, knowing exactly what it would look like if the public ever read the file. None of it was sabotage. It was the accumulated strain of a paper decision meeting a hand that had to pull the trigger, lot after lot, range after range, month after month, until the steel itself started keeping score in the only language a procurement officer could not argue with. By 1989, naval special warfare had rendered its verdict, quietly and permanently. The unit dropped the Beretta altogether and adopted the Sig Sauer P226, later designated the Mark 25, and it never went back. Not for the operators who had been there in 1987, not for the generations who came after them. The engineering problem had been solved and the slide redesign worked, but the SEALs had already answered the only question that mattered, not in a hearing room or on a procurement form, but on a range with their own hands, the same way American soldiers had always settled arguments about which gun to trust. They chose the pistol that had nearly won in 1985. They chose it because the one that did win had already shown them what it was made of. General Wickham's signature retired the M1911 in an afternoon. It took naval special warfare 2 years and 4 injuries to correct his math. Subscribe and tell me in the comments which side of this story you would have trusted.